Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable St. John Spring Speaker Series. My name is Megan Scott. I'm a board member with Sustainable St. John, and I'm here today with Sven Schultisek. He's representing the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, I am in New Brunswick, which is situated in the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. So the role of low carbon hydrogen in the decarbonization of energy systems is becoming clear. But understanding hydrogen's commercial applications and emerging economic development opportunities are only now coming into focus. So this talk explores the role that hydrogen might play in Atlantic Canada's energy system transition. In addition, we'll provide an overview of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance and its priorities for the upcoming year. So Sven, who's joining me, has extensive experience in the energy sector, having worked in oil, wind, and geothermal industries in Europe and North America. He's an expert in energy system transition questions and is leading this portfolio as Net Zero Atlantic's research manager. Sven has been the technical driving force behind the Atlantic Canada Energy System Modeling Project and is leading projects related to hydrogen and offshore wind, as well as the potential clean growth opportunities. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. So please ensure that your video and microphone are off for the entire presentation. And we'll be recording this to be uploaded to YouTube. If you have any questions at all, please use the chat window and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And we'd ask that the chat window is used for questions only. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Sven. So go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. Can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Perfect. All good. Well, welcome everyone to talk about hydrogen, a topic that you probably have heard about a lot over the last couple of weeks, months, and years, or maybe not even that much. It depends on where you are in the hydrogen discussion. It's been a discussion that has resurfaced or surfaced continuously over the last couple of years, and then it went back into the underground again, and then it came back up and it came back down, and now it's here, and I think it's here to stay, at least for the next couple of decades. So I think that situation is quite interesting, and I'm happy to have a chat with you today and to answer any sort of questions that you might have regarding hydrogen and what role hydrogen could play in Atlantic Canada. Megan already said that I work officially for Net Zero Atlantic, and I'm going to advance the slide here. We are an organization that deals a lot with hydrogen. We act as the secretariat to the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance, and that's what I'm representing here today. But just to give you a little bit of background on our organization, and that will become important once I start talking about how the concept of the Hydrogen Alliance was developed. So our organization, we're an independent not-for-profit organization based in Halifax, but looking at the energy system transition in Atlantic Canada. And we see ourselves a little bit as a bit of an impartial knowledge and capacity builder in our region, primarily focused on applied research and project support when it comes to energy system transition topics. That could be any sort of topic. The energy system transition is fairly broad. So it could be offshore wind, it could be onshore wind, it could be geothermal energy, and it can be hydrogen. So for hydrogen, that's what I'm here for today. We do our work in general across sector boundaries, and we usually try to have teams that are based in academia, in industry, in government, and in First Nations or other equity deserving groups as well. So trying to cover a lot of bases here. And when we think about the energy system transition, as I said, lots of different topics that are technology specific. And you can see a couple of those stats on the slide here that by now are probably already a little bit outdated. Our organization, we facilitated over 250, 260 research projects over the last 15, 16 years. We've worked with a lot of highly qualified people all over Canada, but of course with a big focus on Atlantic Canada and our region. And we started our own hydrogen discussions 2.5 years ago or so, where we talked to a lot of the provincial policymakers and we talked to a lot of industrial representatives from Atlantic Canada, and saw that there is a very limited amount of information available regarding the role that hydrogen could play. Discussed internationally, and it was discussed from the Canadian context in general, but the discussion usually stopped somewhere around Quebec. There was a lot of talk about hydrogen in BC, in Alberta, in Quebec, but not really anything in Atlantic Canada. And we thought that that should change and that we should investigate what role hydrogen could really play in our own energy system transition. Because we saw that internationally and nationally, there were a lot of organizations and a lot of groups that had an opinion that hydrogen is necessary to reach deep decarbonization targets and reach net zero. And that's when we set out to create two reports. You can see them here on the slide. One report was focused on the maritime provinces. One report was focused on Newfoundland and Labrador. Those two reports combined together basically create the foundation for a comprehensive picture of the role that hydrogen can play in Atlantic Canada. And what we found out with those two reports, there are a lot of details in those reports. I'm going to go over some of them later in the presentation. And we won't have time to go over everything in both reports, so I'm going to focus a lot on the one in the Maritimes. But if there's questions regarding the Newfoundland and Labrador report, please let me know. Both of those reports are public knowledge, so they're out on our website. You can see our old logo here on the slide still on those reports. We were, before we became Net Zero Atlantic, we were the Offshore Energy Research Association. So that's why that old logo is still on there. But basically what those reports found out is a couple of things. The first one, and that didn't really come as a surprise, is that electrification won't solve all of our GHG emission reduction problems. Electrification is a very powerful tool when it comes to deep decarbonization, but there are sectors in the economy that are inherently difficult to electrify in its standard way. And that's where hydrogen comes in as a really interesting option. And as I already said, those reports found out that there is a significant role for hydrogen in our own energy system in the future. I'm going to go over some of those details later. But they also really highlighted that there's a really interesting global demand for hydrogen. And that, of course, apart from our own deep decarbonization that we need to achieve in Atlantic Canada, that creates export opportunity and economic growth opportunities in our region. Those two reports were facilitated by us and carried out over the last 2 years. The Maritimes report came out in November of 2020, and the feasibility study for Newfoundland and Labrador came out in March of 2021. And following those two reports, we saw a lot of interest and a lot of action when it comes to hydrogen. We had 3 webinars that we hosted as follow-ups for those two reports. We had over 800 people register for those webinars. We had people from organizations from 9 different countries getting excited about hydrogen in Atlantic Canada. So there is a lot of momentum that was being built over the last 2 years. And I'm going to talk about the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance after we talk a little bit more about those two reports and what they found out. But those two reports were really the foundation for the creation of the Hydrogen Alliance, and more on that later as well. I put my email address and our general hydrogen email address on this slide as well. So if you have any questions that we can't answer today, or if you just want to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to jump on a call and have a chat. I already talked a little bit about the study objectives, but to be a bit more on point here, the study objectives, and that's true for both studies, but as I said, I'm going to focus today on the one in the Maritimes, was to assess the economic opportunities and technical challenges of hydrogen production, storage, distribution, and use in our region. And that in of itself is already quite interesting, I think, because when we think about hydrogen, it is a little bit different from just gas. It is different from electricity. It sits somewhere in between, and it breaks down the barriers between electricity and gas use or chemical carriers. And we really wanted to look at the whole value chain of hydrogen. That's why from production to end use, basically. And what we wanted to do in those reports is really identify the role or the roles that hydrogen can play in our own energy system transition. With a time frame where we said, well, our net zero goals come into effect in 2050. So the time frame for those two reports should be 2020 to 2050. So looking at a 30-year energy system evolution in the meantime. And of course, those reports were meant to inform, we called it decision-making for future planning. So that could be the Atlantic Clean Power Roadmap, it could be provincial climate plans, it could be any sort of energy system transition discussions that are taking place right now and have taken place over the last couple of years. But there are also public-facing reports. So part of it was also just to bring attention to the topic and to get information out in the public and to stimulate a discussion with the general public. Focusing on the first report, as I said, just because we don't have time to talk about both of them in detail, the same methodology applies for both reports. Just so that when I'm talking about the Maritimes report, the same is true for the Newfoundland and Labrador report, with slightly different outcomes and a slightly different project team. But I want to introduce the project team that worked on the first hydrogen report. Back then, as I said, we were called OERA. So we were the project lead for this report. But we didn't fund the report and we didn't carry out the actual writing of the report. So on this slide, you can see that the project funders is a quite diverse set of funders. We have Heritage Gas, gas utility in Nova Scotia, Liberty Utilities, a gas utility in New Brunswick, ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency from the federal government, and the government of Nova Scotia in the form of the Department of, how it was then called, the Department of Energy and Mines in Nova Scotia. They all came together, they all had an interest in hydrogen, and they all had an interest in getting this report produced and make so that the public can really engage on that topic further. So those four organizations came together to fund. That was then supplemented by funding through Natural Resources Canada for the extension to Newfoundland and Labrador. So that was an addition. And then we had two organizations jump in as contributors to what we call the Project Management Committee. The Project Management Committee is really the committee that guided the author of the report throughout the process and offered help in any way that they could. Of course, on that PMC were the project funders, but there were also representatives from Atlantic Centre for Energy and the Transition Accelerator. In the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, we of course then extended the PMC to include organizations from Newfoundland and Labrador as well. For example, Econext, formerly NIA in Newfoundland, and a lot of other organizations that contributed with a specific background on the energy system in Newfoundland and Labrador. The actual study authors for the Maritimes part, and then later on for the Newfoundland one as well, were Zed Clean Energy Solutions. They're a consultancy based in Vancouver. They were also the lead authors on the federal hydrogen strategy. They've worked in preparation and on a feasibility study for hydrogen for the BC government. So they have a lot of experience when it comes to hydrogen. They're primarily sourced from individuals that have worked in hydrogen for a long time in the Canadian context, primarily at Ballard. And Zen created this project writing team of Dunsky Consulting and Red Rock Power Systems that really put all the technical knowledge and all the writing knowledge and stakeholder engagement knowledge together to work on this study. When we think about the methodology that was used for both studies, what we try to do with those studies is really have a very broad outreach and get a lot of people together to talk about this topic, to really have a holistic view on the topic and approach it from a lot of different angles. So you can see on this slide that when Zen went through the writing process of the report, there were lots of different methods that they used and how to get information. And we don't need to go through all of them in detail, but of course there's the standard stuff like literature review, published reports, reading those and getting up to speed on what is going on nationally and internationally when it comes to hydrogen. But the local context was really, or the local stakeholders were engaged in workshops and interviews. So we had 3 targeted workshops on hydrogen end uses, utility, the role of utilities in the hydrogen economy, and one specifically focused on the hydrogen supply chain. There were over 60 stakeholders from the Maritimes, and then, of course, in the Newfoundland and Labrador part, additional stakeholders from that province specifically that were engaged in these workshops. They were, for the Maritimes part, 12 targeted interviews with key organizations. There was an online survey, and we collected a lot of really good feedback from representatives of we call it the energy system, basically, in Atlantic Canada, and organizations that had opinions on hydrogen. The two reports go then into a little bit of detail regarding how to produce hydrogen, what the production methods are, which ones are applicable from an Atlantic Canadian perspective, and then going into end users as well. So I'm going to share a little bit of the content about those topics with you today. But as I said, those two reports, they're very large reports. There's a lot of content in there that we can't cover today. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Reach out via email and we can chat about them separately. And of course, I encourage everyone, download those reports, have a look at them. They're really well done, and they provide a really good basis, both as a knowledge basis when we talk about hydrogen, but also they're really good reports in identifying next steps on what could happen in our own region. So when we think about hydrogen production, there's lots of ways how we can produce hydrogen, and that's what makes it partly so interesting. And I've highlighted three ways on this slide. One is electrolysis. That is the process of taking electricity and water and producing hydrogen and oxygen. Of course, when we do that, the GHG emissions are directly dependent on the carbon intensity of the electricity. So that's when we talk about, you might have heard that a lot already in the past, green hydrogen, for example. Green hydrogen just means that the electricity that is being used in the electrolysis process is coming from renewable energy sources. So for example, wind, solar, offshore wind, these kind of things. You can also use electrolysis with grid electricity, for example. So if we think about our electricity grids that we have in Atlantic Canada, they differ in their carbon intensity from province to province. New Brunswick has a very different electricity generation mix than Nova Scotia. New Brunswick has a lot of nuclear in it, but still coal. Nova Scotia has a lot of coal. When we look at PEI, for example, mainly wind-based. Look at Newfoundland, lots of hydro in there. So it really depends on the grid carbon intensity when we want to use grid electricity for electrolysis. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later as well. But basically, the electrolysis pathway is the primary pathway when we talk about colors of hydrogen. Another pathway would be steam methane reforming or autothermal reforming, most often referred to as steam methane reforming or SMR reforming, which is a bit confusing because it's also the same acronym for small modular reactors. That's the process of taking natural gas, water, and heat and producing hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And then, of course, you can see there's carbon dioxide there. So it is not very low carbon in any way. So GHG emission then depend on what do we do with that carbon? Do we capture it? Do we store it? Do we sequester it? Can we do anything with it in an industrial process or not? So carbon intensity really depends on how we treat the carbon that comes out of this process. And then we have pyrolysis, for example, another hydrogen production pathway where we take natural gas and heat and produce hydrogen and carbon black. Carbon black is a feedstock, it's a solid product. It can be used in tire production, for example. But it is not really one of the major pathways when we think about large-scale hydrogen production. When we think from a Canadian context about large-scale hydrogen production, most often we talk about electrolysis or steam methane reforming. Steam methane reforming, primarily when you listen to conversations, for example, in Alberta, of course, there's lots of natural gas there. So there's a big focus on how to create hydrogen from natural gas and what to do with the carbon after. When we think of it from an Atlantic Canadian context, the focus is a lot more on electrolysis. But of course, there are organizations that also look at steam methane reforming. But I would say the majority of organizations is interested in electrolysis. There's other pathways on how to produce hydrogen as well. Biomass gasification, for example. But in general, those are the main ones. Before we go into the results of our study, I want to talk a little bit about the two different scenarios that they modeled, because they show up in a lot of the following graphs. When we think about the scenarios, there's what we called back then a transformative scenario and an incremental scenario. The transformative scenario was really a scenario that had very optimistic assumptions when it comes to technology advancement, policies that are in place, and also the societal adoption of hydrogen and the societal acceptance of hydrogen. The incremental scenario differs a little bit. We don't have a 2050 net zero target, or it is not being met in the scenario. And the assumptions are more conservative when it comes to technology advancements or societal adoption. So it's really, you can think of them as two bookend scenarios. They're not, we should keep that in mind when we look at the results, they're not meant to be two scenarios that are equally likely. Neither of those scenarios is a likely scenario, but we really thought of them as bookend scenarios. Likely the reality in the future is going to lie somewhere in between those two scenarios. And we really wanted to make sure that we capture both ends of that spectrum. When we think of the transformative scenario and say, okay, everything is going from a hydrogen economy perspective in a fairly optimistic way, what we can see there for hydrogen end use is that, again, in the Maritimes, 22% of the delivered energy could be made up or could be delivered by hydrogen. And that's quite a bit. If we compare that to the national numbers, they're very much in the same realm. So in our region, in the Maritimes, we could think of 6.5 megatons of CO2 emissions per year of reduction, roughly 21% of our overall GHG emissions in the region. The numbers for Newfoundland, because the way that Newfoundland is set up, are quite a bit lower. So we're not talking about the 22% of delivered energy. Don't quote me on the number, but it was, I think, around 8 or 9% of delivered energy, but it is in the report. We can have a look at that later. So 22% of delivered energy in the Maritimes by 2050 in the transformative scenario. The interesting point, though, is that hydrogen can be used in a large variety of ways, so that 22% are not one specific end use of hydrogen. The hydrogen end uses are really there's quite a variety of end uses. To talk about a couple of things on this slide here. Focus on the left side first. It's a graph that compares the estimated hydrogen consumption in the Maritimes, both in the incremental scenario and in the transformative scenario for the year 2030 and 2050. So there's lots of good information in this graph, actually. Let's not focus on the colors for now. The colors are the different end uses, and those end uses are for domestic decarbonization. They don't include export. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But what we can see here is that basically two things. There's a big difference between the incremental scenario and the transformative scenario. But there's also a big difference between the hydrogen end use or hydrogen consumption in the year of 2030 to 2050. When we look at the incremental and the transformative scenario in the year 2030, we can see that there is a difference in hydrogen end use, but the difference is not as large as the difference in the year 2050. So that means that, of course, the incremental scenario and the transformative scenario differ because they differ in their assumptions. So they differ in the end use of hydrogen. That's not surprising. But we can see that the incremental scenario, even though it is really conservative, it still produces, or it's still, the maritime region consumes 200,000 tons of hydrogen per year in the year 2050 in the incremental scenario. That is a lot of hydrogen. In the transformative scenario, we're getting into the range of 650, 700,000 tons of hydrogen per year. The other interesting aspect, though, here is that, as I said, in the year 2030, the difference is not large. In the year 2050, the difference is large. So we can see that the majority of hydrogen use in the end use sectors in the maritime provinces and Atlantic Canada in general will likely happen between 2030 and 2050. That is not to say that we should neglect, though, the development that we see here by 2030. Because, of course, well, we're looking at 100,000 tons of hydrogen per year or so. That is an enormous increase from the current use of hydrogen. So there's lots of opportunity for local organizations to get involved in hydrogen production, transportation, storage, and use over the next couple of years. We'll talk a little bit about those organizations and how they got involved with the Hydrogen Alliance later on in a couple of slides. But those were the two main points that I wanted to make on the graph on the left. There's a difference in adoption between the two scenarios, but even the conservative scenario has a quite high hydrogen consumption in our region, and the majority of the development will happen between 2030 and 2050, but we will see an increase in hydrogen activity in our region over the next couple of years, and we've already seen that over the last year or so, quite significantly. When we now look at the colors on those bar graphs, they refer to different hydrogen end uses. And that's really what makes hydrogen very, very interesting from a lot of different perspectives, is that we can use hydrogen for a variety of things. And you can see the list on the right-hand side here. What Zen identified, or what we all agreed upon as really interesting end users from an Atlantic Canadian perspective, are a couple of things. First, as a fuel for electricity production, that means it could act as long-term electricity storage for Atlantic Canada. And that is a very interesting aspect of hydrogen. We all know that we're undergoing an energy system transition. That energy system transition, of course, it touches upon a lot of different sectors, but one of the main sectors that will be transformed rather quickly is the electricity generation sector. And within the electricity generation sector, we all see a fairly common shift away from fossil fuels, more toward variable renewables. With that increased use of variable renewables, we will need an increased use of storage to mitigate any sort of intermittency issues that those variable renewables bring along when it comes to grid stability. So we need to make sure that the lights are on and the heat is running, even when there's no wind and no sun. So for that, we can use batteries, and batteries are an excellent choice for electricity or energy storage in general. But there's limitations to how long you can store electricity in battery form in an efficient way. So for long-term storage, in case we want to really ramp up the flexibility for the electricity grid in general, hydrogen might be an interesting option for that. Second point, fuel for transportation. So when we think about transportation, it is fairly, I mean, you've all seen electric vehicles driving around all across Atlantic Canada, and they're getting more and more popular. So when we think of it like that, there might be a very limited amount of hydrogen demand in transportation. But when we broaden our view to include medium duty and heavy duty long haul transportation, then hydrogen becomes really, really interesting for zero emission fuel cell electric vehicles. And that is something where we see a lot of activity, both in the United States, in Canada, and internationally. Heavy-duty transportation is a big focus on it. Same with, for example, transit, hydrogen buses, something that can be quite interesting. And from our region, a fairly specific application is marine transportation as well. We have a very active fishing sector. There's lots of tugboats out there. There's lots of ferries in Atlantic Canada. So hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuels like ammonia could be a really interesting option for marine transportation as well. Next bullet point, hydrogen heat for buildings. And that means basically what it says right here. We can use hydrogen to heat residential buildings. We can use hydrogen for heat in industry as well as process heat. But for heat for buildings, something really interesting that the two natural gas utilities, Liberty Utilities and Heritage Gas, are really interested in is, can we use hydrogen and, for example, blend it into the natural gas heating system in our two provinces to lower the carbon intensity of the natural gas that is in the pipelines. And of course, when we think about that, if you hear it in international or national context, often people talk about there's like a natural limit to how much hydrogen you can blend into the natural gas system because of embrittlement of steel pipes and so on. Well, when we look at the natural gas system that is in place in Atlantic Canada, or at least in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, that system is fairly new and primarily plastic based. So the blending limits for hydrogen in that specific natural gas system might be higher, because plastic pipes, in comparison to traditional pipes, don't have that same embrittlement issue when it comes to hydrogen concentration. Hydrogen can also be used as an industry feedstock for a variety of different processes in industry. When we think about steel production, for example, is a very, very large opportunity for hydrogen there. But when it comes to the industrial sector, there's lots of very specific applications for hydrogen. We can't really go through all of them now, but there is an enormous opportunity for industry to use hydrogen for a variety of uses. All of those bullet points so far have talked about using hydrogen domestically to decarbonize our own electricity or our own energy system long-term in a variety of end uses. But the last bullet point there is one that is not represented in the graph on the left, but a really, really important one that we need to keep in mind when we talk about hydrogen, and that's export. Hydrogen export opportunity is something that is currently being discussed with increased attention in all provinces. And there's a huge amount of interest in hydrogen in the European market, and Atlantic Canada has the potential to position itself as a long-term strategic partner for the European market and maybe the North American market when it comes to hydrogen production, specifically when it comes to electrolysis, specifically when it comes to green hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. We do have a lot of wind reserves that can be tapped into in Atlantic Canada. We do have a lot of hydro reserves specifically in Newfoundland and Labrador that can be tapped into. There is a development of SMRs in New Brunswick. So the amount of low carbon hydrogen that could be produced in our region is large. So that export opportunity is something that we want to talk about later in a little bit more detail. And I've already talked about hydrogen production, carbon intensity, green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen versus purple hydrogen, and so on. This is all very confusing. So I just wanted to show a couple of graphs that goes through the carbon intensity of hydrogen. And when you hear people talk about different colors, it is basically just a way of talking about carbon intensity of hydrogen and the source that was used to produce that hydrogen for the energy source. So when we think about the carbon intensity of hydrogen production from our own regional perspective, you can see that, again, this is just for the Maritimes. Similar graphics as for Newfoundland and Labrador, but I'm only going to talk about this one right here. You can see at the bottom on the x-axis a couple of those production pathways that I talked about in the beginning. Electrolysis on the left-hand side. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here. Electrolysis on the left-hand side, SMRs plus carbon capture and sequestration, pyrolysis, biomass gasification. And you can see the orange bars, they show you basically the hydrogen carbon intensity. When we think about how we use electrolysis, three different options. We use our current grid electricity. We use grid electricity plus 40% increase in wind power, or we produce hydrogen just from wind. Those were the options that were looked at as part of the study. Not surprisingly, the carbon intensity with 100% grid electricity differs by province. As I said, the electricity generation system differs from province to province. So hydrogen production carbon intensity in Nova Scotia is fairly high, New Brunswick lower, PEI lower. But when we look at this blue line here, that is we called it the low carbon, that basically benchmark. It is a European standard for how to qualify low carbon hydrogen. And the grid electricity is way above that. When we look at grid plus 40% wind, we're still above that, just not in PEI. And if we look at 100% wind power, it's not surprising that the hydrogen that comes out of that is very, very, very low carbon from a production point of view and does not have a carbon intensity attached to it. We can also see, though, that SMRs and CCS qualify as low carbon. That, of course, differs significantly if you remove the CCS parts, and SMR carbon intensity, again, steam methane reforming, not small modular reactors, would, of course, go up quite a bit. We can also see that biomass gasification, depending on the biomass source, and pyrolysis could qualify for low carbon hydrogen. But we need to make sure that we still understand that when it comes to biomass, that's a small scale application for renewable biomass that's available, quite likely. So not small scale, but smaller scale in comparison to what we can do with electrolysis. When we talk about CCS, so carbon capture and sequestration, that the viability is not 100% sure. Like, do we have enough storage capacity in our region to really go for that on a large scale or not? So it became very quickly, the discussion shifted toward electrolysis from a regional perspective as like the main source for hydrogen in our region. When we look at the cost of those production pathways, they differ significantly as well. And that is, of course, something that we also need to talk about, is that hydrogen can offer a lot of potential for decarbonization and for export, but the production cost of hydrogen and the transportation cost for hydrogen are, of course, a factor that we need to talk about. Hydrogen production cost, we can have a look at a graph like this. Again, same setup as before. We talk about electrolysis on the left, SMRs, pyrolysis, biomass gasification. And we can see that the numbers differ quite a bit. And those numbers, you can see one outlier here, offshore wind. The rest of them all fluctuate between $2, $3, $4, $5 per kilogram of hydrogen. Offshore wind is higher at around 8 to 9. But there's a couple of interesting points here that I would like to make on this specific graph. And that's all based on the assumptions that were used in the report. Those assumptions, of course, can be challenged, and we can talk about that. But based on those assumptions, multiple of those production pathways might already be cost competitive if we compare it to the cost of the incumbent fuel, so electricity or gasoline, for example. And the really, really interesting one, and one that we've heard industry talk about a lot recently, is offshore wind. So the most expensive one on this graph, but offshore wind costs are rapidly decreasing at the moment. There's a huge push for offshore wind in the United States and in Europe and in Asia. So we can see that the costs are coming down for offshore wind, and we do have a very large resource in Atlantic Canada for offshore wind. And with that comes a very large opportunity to use offshore wind for hydrogen production that then can be used either domestically or for export. We can talk a little bit more about that later. The report conclusions, both of those reports conclude with a number of recommendations. They all circle around building strategic partnerships, really approaching this topic from a regional perspective, not from a province by province perspective, even though, of course, we are a region made out of 4 provinces. There's a lot of common ground between the provinces when it comes to hydrogen, but there's also specific applications of hydrogen that are limited to 1 province, for example, or 2 provinces. So a regional effort is very, a regional effort is necessary, but we need to be aware of the differences between the provinces. There's recommendations around hydrogen awareness when it comes to the public, de-risking investments, specific policies that should be enacted, hydrogen hub development, so the development of specific geographies, basically where we have hydrogen supply and demand. But the main, I think, one of the main recommendations of the report was really to get ahead of the policymaking schedule and let industry drive part of that conversation and approach it from a regional perspective. And that is really when the Hydrogen Alliance comes into play. And the Hydrogen Alliance is basically a direct outcome of those 2 reports, where after those 2 reports were out, there was lots of interest in all 4 provinces regarding hydrogen. And by now, we're as of yesterday, 53 member organizations of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance. The Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance was officially launched in October of last year. It was an in-person event here in Halifax. And we had, it was great to see so many people come together from all of over Atlantic Canada and gather to officially launch the Alliance. I can't mention all of the different member companies. You can see some of them on this slide and some of them on the next slide. There's gas utilities, electricity utilities. There are municipalities on there, equipment producers. There's provincial governments. There's the you can see the different logos here on the slides. It's a large variety of organizations from all 4 provinces. So we can see that there's a huge interest in the topic from a variety of different perspectives. And that is really, really interesting because we need to make sure that, as I said, we move as a region, but we also approach the topic from a lot of different perspectives. And you can see, for example, on here also the Port of Halifax, the Port of Sydney, the Port of St. John, they're all interested in hydrogen, want to be part of this conversation. And that's basically what the Hydrogen Alliance is about, is getting those organizations together to talk to each other and then clearly work on 4 focus areas. You can see them here on this slide. The focus areas for the Hydrogen Alliance currently are to create a hydrogen strategy or roadmap for our region that really basically is a continuation of the Zen reports that we just talked about, is operationalizing those a bit and making sure that we really identify what are the strategic opportunities for each province, where do we overlap, how can we collaborate together, and where do provinces maybe need to go by themselves. We need to create the enabling conditions. So there's an interest in codes and standards, for example, for hydrogen. We need to make sure that if this hydrogen development actually goes forward and we have a situation where we use hydrogen in a variety of ways, we need to make sure that codes and standards are in place to transport hydrogen across provincial borders, for example, that there are codes and standards to safely handle hydrogen, that there's codes and standards to safely export hydrogen to other markets like Europe. So the enabling conditions, very, very important. Hydrogen hubs, I already said that when we think of hubs, we think of a specific locality with both hydrogen supply and demand. So hubs are necessary and will be developed in our area. And there's huge interest from a lot of different regions to become a hydrogen hub. And that is something that is a clear focus area for the Alliance to really support and promote this hub development and get something off the ground up and running. And then the 4th focus area for the Alliance, of course, is education and outreach, so that we can make sure that people understand what is going on regarding hydrogen in our region, that people understand what the possibilities of hydrogen use are, where the limitations of hydrogen use are, and really drive that discussion and provide materials for that discussion to the general public, but also to policymakers and decision makers in the industry and academia. And in general, I already mentioned the strategy and roadmap. It's something that we haven't created, or that none of the Atlantic provinces have created for themselves. So we hope to work on a regional strategy. But when we look internationally, I already mentioned that Canada has its federal strategy already. When we look at a lot of other jurisdictions around the world, a lot of them have come out with their own hydrogen strategies over the last 2, 3, 4 years. You can see Canada here right in the middle, December of 2020. You can see that there has been a lot of activity since then and a couple of years before that date as well. That slide, I stole it from a really good presentation from the World Energy Council a couple of weeks ago. And we can see that there's an enormous interest internationally in hydrogen. And we can see in the next slide, and it's a bit busy slide, but it basically shows us the interest and what those strategies say in each country for what kind of hydrogen they're talking about in their own country. And you can see at the bottom the legend here. they call it renewable hydrogen. You can think of it as green hydrogen, basically. Fossil fuel based with CCS or blue hydrogen, then pyrolysis, and then fossil fuel based hydrogen without CCS. You can see it's for 2030 and then towards 2050 and beyond. There's a bit of a shift in a lot of those countries where we can definitely see that both blue and green hydrogen are being discussed as interim solutions up to 2030 in a lot of countries. When it comes to 2050 and beyond, the clear focus in most countries is going to be green hydrogen. And that is something that we see a lot of interest in building partnerships with Atlantic Canadian organizations from the European side, where the Germans or the Dutch or the Norwegians, whoever comes across and says like, hey, we have a large demand for hydrogen. And specifically in the case for example, Germany and Netherlands, there is not enough capacity to produce that hydrogen for themselves. So there is an export opportunity for the Atlantic Canadian market. And if we look at this slide, this is just focused on Germany. I stole that slide from, it's called Wasserstoffrat, which is like the Hydrogen Council of Germany. A fantastic presentation 2 weeks ago from Felix Mattes. And he really highlighted something that is shown here on this graph. We don't really need to focus too much on the exact numbers. Basically, the message is Germany needs a lot of hydrogen in the future, and the hydrogen production capabilities of that country are quite limited. And when we look at the different colors, specifically in the year 2050, for example, the light blue color are hydrogen imports, and the light pink rose-colored color is power to liquid imports. So it could be for shipping fuel, aviation, it could be ammonia, for example. And we have feedstock imports in orange. So the only actual production that happens in Germany is forecasted by the German Hydrogen Council is that dark blue part. And you can see that that's fairly small in comparison to the overall demand. So just to highlight that again, there seems to be a large interest from Europe to seek an international, economically and geopolitically stable partner in Canada. And Atlantic Canada, of course, is in the very interesting positions that our ports are very close to European ports in comparison to, for example, Australia or Dubai, which are other countries that the Europeans are talking to when it comes to hydrogen. We're in a really interesting position there. So to sum it up, and that's the last slide, really easy, simple conclusion slide. Hydrogen has the potential to become an important part of our own decarbonization portfolio. We can reduce GHG emissions in a variety of sectors with a variety of applications of hydrogen. And it is not the case that hydrogen will be the silver bullet to solve all of our problems. And it's not going to be the case that electrification is going to be the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. They both play a part, and there will be other decarbonization strategies that will also play parts on our own pathway toward net zero by 2050. The last bullet point, hydrogen offers a significant economic growth potential for Atlantic Canada when it comes to export, specifically to the European market, but also to other markets in the short to midterm future. And that's it. That was my last slide.
Great, thanks very much, Sven. A lot of information there, but really well explained, and some excellent graphs there. I love those. So we have a number of questions. We'll get straight to those. Let's see here. Okay, so lots of comments, which is great. A question from Robert Scott. He says, I noticed in the Maritimes report, the Alliance is hoping to promote a pilot project to incorporate hydrogen processes at the Irving Low Refinery. Has there been any discussions to incorporate that product at their downstream retail service station locations? So similar to the Shell model, install a hydrogen dispenser at a gas station or convenience store for use by vehicle drivers. Oh, you're on mute, Sven.
Sorry for that. I can't comment on the specifics of Irving Oil. That would be a discussion that needs to be had with Irving Oil directly. But we do know that when we talk to our colleagues, for example, at the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association of Canada, that there is a lot of interest in promoting hydrogen fueling stations for the transportation network in general. And it would probably not be a stretch to say that we will see something like that in Atlantic Canada in the long-term future as well, if there is an uptake specifically for heavy-duty transportation. But when it comes to the specific refinery from Irving Oil and their plans, I can't comment on that. That's really something that would need to be answered by Irving Oil directly.
Okay. Anyone from Irving Oil is here and wants to pipe up, feel free. Let's see. So next question is from Sam. How do you propose Atlantic Canada can position itself as an exporter? While the capacity for production is large, the cost of electricity in Atlantic Canada is significantly higher than a number of other provinces in Canada and much higher than the US. This implies to me that all business cases are dependent on securing extremely low power purchase agreement contracts and that only extremely large projects would be feasible.
It's a really, really good question. And when we talk to the European partners, there's a clear message that, especially nowadays with everything that's going on in Europe and the war in Ukraine, there is an increased interest in getting or establishing a relationship with a long-term geopolitically stable partner. That might also work in our favor so that higher prices might be acceptable up to a certain point. But of course, costs need to be competitive and costs need to come down for hydrogen production. So when we think about hydrogen production for our domestic demand, for example, in comparison to export, we're talking about two very different scales. And when we think or when we talk to industrial participants that are interested in hydrogen export opportunities, that there's a certain stream that really goes for proposals of really large, specific, dedicated hydrogen production projects. So you can think about, for example, offshore wind. It's like one of those examples. Offshore wind is a very expensive technology if you only build one small turbine, but economies of scale and in general cost decreases can lead to a very large offshore wind project quite likely being competitive. When it comes to hydrogen production, that is, the electricity is not necessarily only used for electricity supply into the domestic grid. But that's also a very interesting discussion to be had, is what's the balance between using really good resources in the Atlantic Canadian system, for example, for wind, and using them just for export opportunity of hydrogen. Because of course we need to make sure that electricity is also we need to make sure that electricity is affordable for Atlantic Canadians as well. So if you have a really good resource there, there's a discussion to be had. So what is the right balance between using it for export of hydrogen versus using it for decarbonization of our own economy here in Atlantic Canada? But economies of scale will drive down the cost long term. But the first couple of hydrogen projects will be expensive. There's no way around that.
Great. Thank you. So kind of further to that, Daniel is asking, it took 20 years to bring the onshore wind down. How many years will it take to bring down the offshore wind costs?
Bring down in terms of cost. We've seen a really steep decrease in cost when it comes to offshore wind fairly recently. So it's really interesting when you read reports about offshore wind and talk to the offshore wind industry. If a report is basically half a year old, most of the data is already outdated. There's so much movement in that market at the moment when it comes to technology development, different rotor sizes, for example, and in general technological advancements in turbine design that drive down the costs quite significantly. So there is a lot of movement. We see a very quick decline in cost, but it really gets interesting when we talk about these large scale projects. And that's something that when we look to the European market, for example, projects are being discussed that a couple of years ago nobody would have discussed. Denmark is building they call it Winder, the energy island. It's an artificial island that will just host wind turbines to produce hydrogen. And they're creating the island, the wind turbines, and produce hydrogen from that. So there's some really interesting ideas out there that a couple of years ago were just deemed way too expensive. But due to the large reduction in cost that we've already seen and that is forecasted to happen in the future, I think we'll see more of these kind of things coming our way. But of course, we always need to say that those forecasts, price forecasting, cost forecasting is really tricky, right? So there's a huge amount of uncertainty regarding the future development, but all the pointers are pointing into the right direction, at least as of now.
Mm-hmm. So fewer than 20 years, hopefully.
Yeah, I would assume so.
Yeah. Great. And a question from Sam. So why would Germany be different from Atlantic Canada in terms of production? Why is their production forecast to be smaller than here?
It's just a matter of space. And we have Nikolai Pugal from Germany here. He already raised his hand. He can jump in as well and build on what I'm about to say. There's a lack of space for let's talk about wind, for example. There's a lack of space for wind turbines. Germany is a fairly constrained country when it comes to land use for energy developments. In Canada, we have more land available for onshore wind up to a certain degree, but we also have a huge coastline, and the offshore wind reserve or like resource that we have out here with really large and high wind speeds and large areas where we could put turbines. That is just something that is not the case for Germany. There's a limited amount of coastline, a limited amount of offshore wind potential in the North Sea. And that is just, it's not limitless in Canada, but the limits are quite significantly higher than in Germany. And Nikolai, please feel free to jump in anytime.
Yes, unmute yourself and.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Nikolai Pugadl. I lead the Secretariat for the Energy Partnership between Canada and Germany on the federal level. And so thanks for Sustainable St. John and also Sven for you guys participating and hosting. Yeah, to the question directly, yeah, I agree with everything that Sven said. Basically, we just don't have the land mass and the coast to produce enough sustainable energy for ourselves to drive electrification and the electrolysis. Just to give you the number on the scale, like the old hydrogen strategy from Germany had like a goal of 5 gigawatts electrolysis capacity by 2030, and they just upped the number to 10 gigawatt just domestic capacity for electrolyzing capacity within Germany until 2030. But that still leaves a gap of 90 to 110 terawatt hours per year, exactly what you're showing there, Sven. So there's a huge demand, and so import is one of the key issues right now also within the energy partnership. And maybe I can just point you to the link I sent earlier in the chat about the discussions around the regulations of the EU market. Because I think it will be key what's going to be decided in Europe in the next about year or so, what kind of what qualifies as I would say, quote unquote, acceptable for the Europeans as a whole in terms of production, etc. And I guess that drives a lot of the discussions around which projects make sense and which make not. And my understanding is it's a collaborative process. So I think mid-late March, there's going to be a directive out from the EU, and then international stakeholders have an opportunity to kind of engage and then kind of give feedback on that. And in the event I posted, that's an EU-Canada discussion round, which is not directly an energy partnership, which I represent, but it's has a lot of the people we talk to, and I know you, Sven, know. So I encourage everybody to kind of join that event and share it with the networks with interested people. And thanks again to you guys at Sustainable St. John to actually host today.
Oh, absolutely. We're pleased to be hosting, and thanks for posting that link as well. So everyone make sure to check that out in the chat. So thanks, Nikolai. I don't know if there are any other questions for you. We spoke about that. So Keith Miller, will hydrogen not be hydrogen not be governed maybe by international standards, I think, is that?
It's a really important point when we talk about codes and standards development, that we need to make sure that any sort of codes and standards that we develop in, be it in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or in Atlantic Canada, basically all the standards need to feed into each other so that hydrogen that is produced somewhere in Canada can be used, transported across Canada, used in a different part of Canada, and also being fed into the international market. And that's something that a lot of work is going into that. Natural Resources Canada has hosted lots of federal working groups in that direction to really make sure that we're all part of that discussion and not developing something that doesn't really work well with other parts of the energy system, be it in Canada or worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, extremely important, I would imagine. And then another question from Daniel. Is the offshore wind cost in the slide take in account the capacity factor? Oh, in the slide, sorry, he must be speaking to the presentation. So,
okay.
Yeah.
In general, I don't remember the numbers that were used in the report for offshore wind capacity factors, but of course, the capacity factor for offshore wind has a very large impact on the overall levelized cost of electricity that we get from offshore wind, and that, of course, in turn drives the hydrogen production cost as well. So that is something when we think about the offshore wind resource that is out here, the wind speed is really high. We all know that Atlantic Canada is a really windy place, right? But when you look at it from a wind speed perspective, average wind speed, and compare it to some parts of the North Sea or some parts in the United States where we see lots of offshore wind development happening right now, we're higher than that. That wind speed quite likely directly translates into a larger capacity factor as well, which then drives down the cost. So it's a really interesting combination of factors that speak for the potential that is out there for offshore wind. But we're just at the starting point of that discussion, right? It's early days from an Atlantic Canadian perspective to talk about offshore wind and hydrogen. But what we see is just a lot of interest in it at the moment. So we're happy to talk about it. We're happy to provide information and data on it, just to keep that conversation going and provide a basis for discussion and decision making in the future.
Great. So what, in terms of, what are the next steps? What are the next kind of goals in terms of things that you're working on and actions that, that need to be taken?
Currently, there's a lot of work going on into the creation or into how we can create a hydrogen strategy and roadmap for Atlantic Canada. So that is something, as I said, we are a region made up of 4 provinces. Every province has their own specific directions and interests when it comes to hydrogen. So we need to figure out how can we move as a region, but how can we also be aware that we're mindful of the differences that exist between New Brunswick and Newfoundland, for example. It's 2 different provinces, but we share a lot of things. So we need to move as a region, especially when it comes to export opportunities. When we talk to the European partners, sometimes they don't understand why 2.5 million people in Atlantic Canada have 4 different governments and everybody talks about something in a slightly different way. It's a bit confusing, right? From an outsider's perspective. So that is something where a lot of work is focused on, and in general, the hub development, identifying locations in Atlantic Canada and organizations in Atlantic Canada that really want to make sure that we have local supply and demand for hydrogen. There's a lot of focus on that.
Right. And in terms of a timeline, like, are you looking at a deadline or any kind? What are your hopes in terms of having an end product for the roadmap specifically?
The roadmap, we're currently so I can't remember when we had that RFP open. We're currently scoping how that roadmap and strategy could be created. So it's basically an exercise in identifying what have other jurisdictions done when it comes to strategy and roadmap creation. What are the methods? What methods were used? Which ones are applicable for Atlantic Canada? And then identify a timeline and a scope and a budget for it. So that exercise is we're currently working on that. So I can't really give you an exact answer because we're trying to figure that out. but it's something in the matter of months, not weeks.
Right. Let's see. So I don't think we have any more questions. I guess we're over time by about 5 minutes, but I just wanted to also, you mentioned 3 webinars that you hosted. Are those on the website as well?
Correct. Yeah, you can watch those. They're recorded webinars. They're on the website. You can watch those on the website. They're hosted there. And if you have trouble finding them, just let me know. I'm happy to point you in the right direction. Perfect. Okay. Well, if there isn't anything else, I think we'll wrap things up now. So, yeah, Sven, thank you so much. This was extremely enlightening, and it's just very exciting, really. So, you know, we're really looking forward to having a roadmap, and you know, and what will come out of that, and being able to take some concrete action in terms of progressing towards having this a part of our, you know, our future and our economy. So thank you very much for presenting. Thank you for hosting, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Great, and certainly we'll stay in touch, and love to have you on again when you have some more updates for us. Happy to. Yeah, great. And also I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors, Port St. John and Commercial Properties Limited. So without you, you know, we wouldn't be able to do the work we do here at Sustainable St. John. And also, as I mentioned, this will be posted on the Sustainable St. John YouTube channel, so you can find it there. If you have any interest in becoming a board member or have any suggestions for Sustainable St. John, you can reach out to us at info@sustainablestjohn.ca. So thank you very much, Sven, and thanks everyone, and enjoy your afternoon. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.